She didn't have a name, just a number. 089-L, stamped on a thin metal tag punched through her ear before her eyes had even opened. She was born in a cage, steel mesh beneath her paws, galvanized wire around her body, a mother beside her who didn't look at her, didn't move, not because she didn't care, but because she couldn't. Not after losing 10 before her. She learned early that silence was safer than sound, that food came from gloved hands that never paused to touch, that water tasted like rust, that the only sky she'd ever see was the corrugated metal roof above her, sweating in the heat and frozen in winter. She was a mink, one of thousands, born to be worn. They didn't care that her species was solitary in the wild, that she would have carved a tunnel home along a riverbank, hunted frogs at dusk, curled into herself to sleep. In the cage, she could only spin in circles, chew on the bars, and wait. And wait. For the day the doors opened, not to freedom, but to killing. They were never told how it happened, but they knew. They heard the screams. They felt the ground tremble. They saw the workers come and leave without the ones who used to be in the cages beside them. So when the day came for 089L, she didn't resist. She didn't whimper. She just went still. But that day, something went wrong. Someone forgot to lock the transport door. Someone else turned their back. And in that brief, silent sliver of chance, she moved. She ran. And this time, someone was watching. She didn't know where she was running, only that it was away from the smell of ammonia and metal, away from the white coats and the screams, away from the rusted cages that still echoed with the scratching of claws and the silence of those who no longer moved. The ground beneath her paws was wrong, cold, hard, unfamiliar, but it was moving, and she was moving, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't inside anything. The air hit her like a wave, real air, bitter and wide and full of scent, trees, mud, smoke, life. Her heart beat so hard it felt like it might break. Every sound made her flinch, every shadow made her duck. She didn't know what a forest was. She didn't know what freedom looked like, but her body remembered. Her instincts, buried beneath a life of wire and routine, flickered like old fire finding dry wood. She ran until she couldn't, until her legs shook and her breath came in ragged gas and the cold seeped into her bones. She found a hollow under a fallen tree and curled into it, trembling. She didn't sleep. She just waited for the hands to come back, for the metal door to shut again, for the end. But morning came instead, and with it, voices. She didn't understand the words, but she knew they weren't the same. They weren't sharp or angry. They were soft, uneven, scared even. There were lights, yes, and movement, but the energy was different, slower, curious, careful. They didn't grab her. They didn't shout. They crouched down, lowered their bodies to the earth, and just watched. One of them had a box, not a cage, something different. There was food inside, water, a blanket that smelled like other animals. Not fear, not death. She didn't trust them, but she was tired and cold, and something in her, something small, flickering, wounded but still alive, leaned forward. They called her hope. She didn't know what it meant, but it came with warmth and quiet and no screaming. They took her to a place without metal, without screaming, where her paws touched soil instead of steel, where the air moved without stinking of chemicals, where she had space to stretch without scraping against wire. She didn't understand it. She paced for days. She bit at her own fur, circled corners, waited for the pain to come again, but it didn't. No one pulled her out of her box. No one tied her down. No one reached for her neck. Instead, someone waited, sat by her door, read aloud, not words she understood, but voices that didn't frighten her. And slowly, very slowly, she began to believe she wasn't going to die. Not this time, not in silence, not without ever knowing what the sky really looked like. It wasn't easy. Healing never is, not when pain is all you've known. She flinched at every creak in the floor. She panicked when doors closed too loudly. She wouldn't eat unless the room was silent, unless the lights were dimmed, unless she could see every shadow. But she was watching now, not frozen, not shut down, watching. And when they opened the outdoor enclosure for the first time, she didn't bolt. She stepped out one paw at a time, every movement tense, alert, unsteady. The grass was cold, wet, real. It bent under her weight, something her feet had never felt before. She didn't understand when, but she let it pass over her. She didn't know what birds were, but she turned her ears toward their songs. She didn't recognize the smell of pine or rain or sunlight warming wood, but her nose lifted anyway. And then she looked up. No cages, no roof, no steel, just sky. It was wider than anything she had ever known. So wide it frightened her, so beautiful it made her pause. She didn't know if she should run or hide or just stand there and breathe. So she stood and breathed. And the volunteers watching from behind the fence didn't speak, didn't move, didn't dare break the moment. Because what they were witnessing wasn't just survival, it was return. Return to something that had never truly died in her, to something stolen, and now slowly given back. Her story spread. Someone posted a photo, Hope standing under the sky, ears perked, eyes wide. Not with fear, but with the beginning of wonder. It went viral. People started asking questions. Where was she from? What had happened to her? How many more were still trapped? The farm was located, exposed. Dozens more were rescued. Some too sick to move. Some already gone. But not all. Because of Hope, they weren't invisible anymore. Because of Hope, silence turned into outrage, into signatures, into noise. She had never made a sound, but somehow she'd been heard. And in that quiet ripple of attention, something ancient shifted. Not just in her bones, but in the world around her. People who had never cared suddenly couldn't stop looking. People who had once called it luxury now called it cruelty. They read the reports, they saw the photos, rows and rows of cages, paws bloodied from wire floors, mouths open but silent, because some screams don't make it past the lungs. They learned that mink are solitary animals, that they are territorial, sensitive, intelligent, that the way they live in the wild could not be replicated in boxes stacked 6 high, that what had been done to her wasn't farming, it was stripping something wild and irreplaceable down to fur and silence. Hope didn't know any of this. She didn't read articles or headlines. She didn't understand that laws were being proposed in her name, that thousands of voices had risen up to say, enough. She just ran her paw across the grass, lifted her face to the sun, slept curled in a bed that didn't smell like fear. But because she had lived, because she had escaped, others now would too. A school added her photo to a mural on animal rights. A mother explained to her daughter why they no longer bought real fur. A former fur farm worker sent in a letter, anonymous, apologizing not for the job, but for the silence. And all across the world in corners no one thought to look before, cages began to rust. Some were emptied by force, some by law, and some by choice. Because Hope hadn't just survived. She had reminded the world that cruelty doesn't always scream. Sometimes it waits in silence, until someone is brave enough to listen. And when that someone listens, really listens, not just with ears, but with conscience, with discomfort, with the willingness to sit in what's ugly and unfixable, they don't walk away unchanged. One woman who had worn fur her whole life donated every coat in her closet. A high-end designer, famous for mink-trimmed hoods, released a public statement. We were wrong. A former buyer turned whistleblower leaked footage that made even the coldest audiences cry. Hope's story became a thread, and from that thread, a tapestry unraveled, revealing how deeply woven cruelty had been into luxury. But now people were pulling at the seams, asking questions, demanding transparency, refusing to pay for suffering stitched into fashion. And meanwhile, in a quiet sanctuary far from all of it, Hope lived. She dug tunnels. She climbed logs. She slept in circles under leaves, breathing with a body that had once known only fear. There were days when she still startled, still spun in anxious loops, still froze when a shadow passed overhead. But healing isn't linear. It's not clean. It's not soft. It's work. And she was doing it every time she stepped into the sun instead of hiding. Every time she ate from a bowl without checking for hands. Every time she chose to be in her own body instead of floating outside of it. She didn't know she'd sparked a movement. She didn't know she'd saved anyone. She just knew she wasn't in a cage anymore. And that was enough. Enough to remind people that a life doesn't have to be grand to be sacred. That you don't need to understand an animal's language to respect its suffering. That silence, when endured long enough, becomes its own kind of scream. And that choosing to hear it is a form of courage. Hope's sanctuary never made the news again. There were no documentaries, no awards, just the quiet rhythm of survival. Hers and the others who followed. More rescues, more names exchanged for numbers, more tiny bodies trembling on their first day of freedom. Some made it, some didn't, but they were seen. And once you've seen, you can't unsee. Not the bars, not the blood, not the whimpering that comes not from pain, but from a life never allowed to be lived. People began to change, not in waves, but in ripples. They chose faux over real, compassion over tradition, questions over silence. A child asked why her teacher wore a mink hat, and the teacher didn't have an answer. A boutique quietly removed its winter line. A shipment of pelts sat untouched in a customs warehouse, indefinitely. And somewhere in that chain reaction, the system cracked. Not because hope roared, not because she fought, but because she survived long enough for someone to care. And that survival carried a message louder than any protest ever could. There is no beauty in suffering, no luxury in pain, no fashion worth a broken body. And still, the store windows shimmered with coats that whispered silence. Silence of cages hidden behind clean glass. Silence of hands paid to kill gently, because killing was the job, not the crime. Silence of buyers who looked at the lining, not the life. Who ran fingers through softness without asking what that softness cost. But Hope's story wouldn't let that silence settle. Not completely. She had no voice, but she had witnesses. People who carried her image in their minds when they saw a fur collar in a catalog. People who hesitated at the word luxury. People who asked themselves, quietly, honestly, at what price? She had become more than a rescued mink. She was a shift, a line in the sand. Proof that survival is not just endurance, but resistance. That staying alive after everything is its own rebellion. Because she did not give beauty. She did not give comfort. She gave truth. The kind that scratches beneath the surface of every choice we make. The kind that asks not just what we wear, but who we wear. And once that question is asked, really asked, there is no going back. You cannot unknow the sound of cages. You cannot unknow the ache of a body born to roam, forced to rot. You cannot unknow hope. And that knowing? That is where change begins. Not in headlines or laws or sweeping gestures, but in the quiet recalibration of a single heart, in the discomfort that lingers after you learn the truth, in the pause before a purchase, in the refusal to look away. That's where it starts. With one person deciding that kindness matters more than tradition, that life matters more than luxury, that no coat, no trim, no trend is worth the breath of a creature who only ever wanted to be free. Hope didn't live forever. She wasn't meant to, but the life she got, the real life, the one with wind and soil and sky, it mattered. It mattered enough for others to notice. It mattered enough to ripple outward. And those ripples turned to waves. Countries banned fur farming. Designers dropped entire collections. Stores that once boasted real mink began advertising cruelty-free alternatives. And while some called it progress, others knew better. It was penance, a small attempt to balance a scale that had been tilted for too long. A whisper of apology in a world that had screamed its indifference for decades. Hope's name faded from headlines, but not from memory, not from the hearts of those who had once stood in front of her cage and promised never again. Because that's what change really is. Not noise, not fire, not fury, but presence, persistence, the choice to do better, not louder. And when enough people make that choice, that's how cruelty ends, quietly, and how compassion begins, loudly, in actions that echo far beyond words, in hands that choose to build sanctuaries instead of cages, in eyes that look and truly see, not a product, not a luxury, but a life, in parents teaching children that real warmth comes from kindness, not coats, in communities sharing hope's story not for pity, but for purpose. Because when truth is spoken enough times, when silence is shattered enough times, it becomes something louder than outrage. It becomes memory, and memory is hard to ignore. Hope's image ended up in classrooms, on protest signs, in documentaries that began not with statistics, but with her eyes. People who had never heard of a mink before now couldn't forget her. Her softness was no longer something to touch, but something to protect. And in that shift, from object to being, from fashion to someone, the world changed just enough to matter. Not all at once, not everywhere, but enough. Enough for a cage to remain empty. Enough for a life to be spared. Enough for someone, somewhere to whisper, because of her. And that's the power of one life seen, one life saved, one story told again and again, until it doesn't feel extraordinary, only necessary. Because once we stop treating compassion as exceptional and start treating it as expected, the world shifts. Not with headlines, but with choices made when no one is watching. When someone walks past a boutique window and doesn't turn back. When a teenager refuses to buy into cruelty just to fit in. When a government official reads one more letter, sees one more image, and decides, this ends here. That's where hope's story lives now. In those invisible intersections between memory and action. In the brief second before someone clicks add to cart. In the quiet pause before fingers touch fur in a thrift store. In the decision not to normalize the unnecessary. Hope didn't change the world, but she changed enough of it. And that was the point. She didn't need to become a movement. She was a reminder that suffering hidden in plain sight is still suffering. That silence doesn't mean safety. That the line between cruelty and comfort is thinner than we want to admit. And sometimes all it takes to redraw that line is a single, small life that refused to disappear. Not because she fought, not because she bit or screamed or made anyone listen, but because she stayed, because she survived long enough to be noticed. And once she was seen, not as a coat, not as a statistic, not as just another animal, but as hope, everything changed. Not all at once, not loudly, but in the slow, stubborn way that real change always begins. Her story became a litmus test, a mirror, a quiet demand. Now that you know, what will you do? Because that's the thing about stories like Hope's. They don't let you pretend anymore. They don't let you look at fur-trimmed boots or mink-lined gloves without remembering what softness was stolen. They remind you that behind every luxury labeled real is something very real indeed. A cage, a cry, a cost. And in that remembering, we're given a choice. We can turn away, let the discomfort fade, tuck the story back where it came from, or we can carry it, let it pull at us. Let it shape how we spend, how we speak, how we see. That's what hope gave the world. Not just survival, not just sympathy, but a blueprint for conscience. A reason to ask better questions, a reason to demand better answers. Because no life should have to suffer to teach us compassion. But when one does, when one endures enough pain to make the world flinch, we owe it more than pity. We owe it change. And sometimes all it takes is to remember the eyes behind the fur, the body behind the trim, the breath behind the silence. That is where the line begins again. Hope died years later in a sanctuary far from the wire cages and rusted sheds of her first home. There were no flashbulbs, no breaking news, just soil beneath her paws, sky above her back, and air that never again tasted like ammonia or fear. She was older than anyone expected her to live. Her coat had thinned, her eyes had clouded, but she was still there, still breathing, still free. They buried her under a willow tree where the wind never stopped moving. The caretakers placed a stone, not with a name, but with a single word, enough. Because that was what she had been. Enough to break the illusion, enough to challenge comfort, enough to hold a mirror to a world that dressed its cruelty in style. And now the rest is up to us. To stop pretending we don't know, to stop confusing beauty with violence, to stop buying silence when what we need is truth. Her story isn't rare. That's what makes it urgent, because somewhere right now, another animal is living the life she escaped. And maybe, just maybe, they're waiting for us. Not to save them, not to be heroes, but to be human, to speak when it's easier to stay quiet, to choose compassion over custom, to remember hope, not just as a name, but as a responsibility. Because if she could endure that much pain, we can at least say, never again. If this story stayed with you, don't let it stop here. Tell someone, share her name. Refuse the silence that once caged her. Every voice matters. Every choice echoes. And the next hope is waiting. Not just to be rescued, but to be remembered. Say her name, share her story, and wear only kindness. Because no fashion is worth a broken body, and no life should end just to keep us warm. Let's be the reason the cages stay empty. Let's be the reason hope wasn't the last.